minister to us. We have men of God, women of God who will be sharing this evening, but we need the Holy Spirit to talk to us, God's voice to be audible through them. Shall we commit this prayer, this meeting into the hands of God? Shall we pray together? Father, we want to thank you for this wonderful evening you have given us, Lord Father, as we, your people, could come together in this manner for this seminar, Lord Father. We thank you for this church. We thank you for the every ministries that you undertake through this church, Lord Father. Especially we pray and thank you for the ministry of Freedom Ministries, which cater to the mental health of the church and communities outside the church. Father, we pray that this evening that we spend together at your feet may be very beneficial and effective to our lives, Lord Father. Lord, as much as you are concerned for our spiritual life, you are also concerned for our mental health, Lord Father, because Bible says you are close to the brokenhearted. Father, whatever situations of life we are going through this evening, Father, we pray you may speak to us through your servants, Lord Father. Lord, we have with us anointed and professional people who will speak to us from their expertise of life. Father, we pray beyond their words, beyond what they speak, we need your Holy Spirit and your voice to be heard into our hearts and our ears, Lord Father. We commit and submit ourselves in your mighty hands of God. Father, we pray that when we leave after this meeting, after this seminar, we may be changed internally and we may be changed in our mental attitude and awareness about what mental health is all about, Lord Father. We humble and submit ourselves in the mighty hands of God. In Jesus' name, we offer this prayer. Amen, amen, amen. I want to invite Jacob to please come forward and give an introduction before we get into the rest of the meeting.
Thank you. Good evening and welcome to the ICA Freedom Ministries Mental Health Awareness Seminar. In the United States, 1 in 5 adults suffer from a diagnosable mental illness. Out of that 1 in 5, only half of them will ever seek treatment. When an individual struggles with mental illness, the family struggles, the individual struggles at school and at work. Research shows that adults with 1 or more severe mental illness dies 25 years earlier than the ones without severe mental illness. Suffering in silence has become the norm for many. Many suffer behind a smile while others can't, as they're so hopeless and depressed. Many people are ashamed to ask for help, worried that they're the only ones struggling, blaming themselves for something they have no control over. Let us overcome the stigma associated with mental illness. Let's get ourselves and our loved ones the help they deserve. Stop pretending as if everything is okay when everything is not. Every one of us presenting here are part of an organization called MMHPA, which stands for Malayali Mental Health Provider Association. They have dedicated their time and wealth of knowledge for this presentation. And I wanted to thank every one of you. Without further ado, I'm going to invite Anita, who is going to be moderating this presentation and inviting each presenter.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Anita Thanikel. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I have the pleasure of presenting each of our speakers. Before I forget, I just want to let you know in the back of the pews there are index cards, so you can always grab it at any time. If you hear something that's important to you, feel free to write it down. If you have a question, feel free to write it down so that we can use it later for the question and answer time. We will now hear from Dr. Binu Chacko, who is an attending psychiatrist at Sagamore Children's Psychiatric Center. He also has a private practice in Massapequa, where he treats children, adolescents, and adults, along with individuals who are struggling with alcohol and opioid addiction. Dr. Chacko will present on the topic of addiction.
Thank you for having me. It's a beautiful day, and thank you all for setting time apart and coming here to listen to the various topics that we have organized for you today. Again, let's thank God for this day as well, to allow us all to come together to talk about serious issues, right? I guess a few days ago, or you may have heard on the news, our Surgeon General, he had put out a statement about the seriousness of, I guess, mental illness affecting those people or at large in the U.S., right? About how loneliness has affected many people since COVID time, and how it's becoming like a serious concern, and how we must deploy certain strategies to kind of help the community. So this is not just a problem for our community, but it's a large problem. So definitely our community has also sought out many help during the pandemic time because of professionals coming forward and giving talks and different things like that. So it's also important for us to kind of know where we all are in our life, and if there is a problem within our lives, to kind of seek help, right? With that in mind, keep an open mind today. My presentation is a little bit long. It's also because I wanted to kind of hit certain points that I may not get a chance to present to you again, especially because all these youths are here. I definitely want them to kind of hear it. So I've been collecting some new data because I've also kind of attended certain other presentations, and we'll kind of dive into all those. So my topic for today is on addiction, right? And follow along with me on the slides. Next slide. So want to, start with a small case presentation just to kind of do it in this medical way. So James is a 17-year-old boy with no past medical or psychiatric history who comes in for his annual physical exam. He's a B+ student and two-sport varsity athlete who's finishing 11th grade and starting to look at colleges. He reports occasional drinking with friends on weekends, but reports never using illicit drugs. So illicit drugs could be marijuana, etc., right? By senior year in high school, 80% of teens will have tried alcohol, or about half will have tried marijuana. In that regard, James's report does not seem unusual or concerning. So this is, how we are processing that information that we are giving, but there's more to this, right? I'm not going to ask anyone if you know somebody who is struggling with any kind of substance use issues and things like that, because we have to kind of allow for anonymity and all that. But then if you have any questions, I guess save it for the end. I think there's a panel discussion, so we'll kind of dive into those specific questions you may have. Honoring your privacy, you can write it in those cards that's provided to you. So moving along. So however, teens are particularly vulnerable to both acute and long-term consequences for substance use, and preventing, delaying, or reducing substance use is an important public health goal. So the next few slides, I will briefly review the neurobiology of the impact of substances on the adolescent brain, okay? So next slide. We can see here the brain weight by age slide, right? As you can see from the left, as it goes to the right, the brain weight is increasing, and by looking at that curve, it kind of flattens out, from age 12 onwards, right? So by approximately age 12, the human brain has reached adult size and weight. Despite gross appearance, significant functional brain growth and development continue into the mid-20s. So as you can see in that cartoon, the dad with the glasses, right? He's saying, "Don't you gross anatomy me, young lady. You can't go drinking until you mature on a cellular level," right? Even though there's a drinking age of 21 and all that in this country, I don't know if anybody is going to be surprised if I tell you there are kids in school drinking as young as 8, 7 years old. It may not be within our community, or our kids may not know specific kids in that category, but definitely it's happening. And our kids may even get exposed as they get close to 10th grade, 11th grade, 12th grade. And for sure, I know our kids are getting exposed to alcohol and marijuana. And, you know, without mentioning names and divulging too much information, I will say, you know, there have been people even selling, okay? So just to kind of put it out there, you know, our population is not, you know, kind of protecting itself from doing the wrong thing and things like that, right? There are people getting into the wrong stuff even within our Indian community, or Malayali community to be specific. All right, so next slide, we'll kind of get into some of the details about brain development, right? I want to give you the information, the biology that a lot of the kids may already know, but I'll kind of give you an overview. So initial phases of brain development involve increasing gray matter connections between cells. This results in a large number of relatively slow connections, well suited for learning. In subsequent phase of development, gray matter decreases via apoptosis of neurons, which is basically cell death, and pruning of synaptic connections. And basically, it's a normal thing that's happening. And myelin, it forms around these pruned white matter tracts, resulting in smaller number of fast connections associated with proficiency. So think of the young brain is a brain that's like not well insulated in one sense. If you can think of the neurons or the brain connections as wires and electrical, you know, information is being, you know, sent through them. And then as the brain matures, it's actually maturing in this fashion where myelin is formed, which is like the insulation. And this development is what I'm going to be talking about when I say your teenage brain, even though you're 12 and you have reached the adult size, it's not fully mature yet, because it'll take you another 13, 14 years till age 25 to fully get myelinated. And only when you grow up to that age will you realize, it's like, oh yeah, I did some silly stuff back in those days, but now I can think clearly, I make better decisions and all that. So moving to the next slide, if you can see this image of the brain development. At the younger ages, as you can see, it's like lit up fully, right? The red, the green, the yellow, all those colors. And as the brain matures, it is getting more insulated, it is settling down a little bit, and the blue color is like the more neutral type of color, okay? So the warmer color represents the higher gray matter density and the increased firing rate and all that. And we'll actually kind of get into, you know, some PET scans and the images that will kind of look similar, but hopefully you understand, you know, the more mature brain in the 20s and later will be a calmer brain, but very proficient in whatever the function that they involve themselves in. Next slide. So brain maturation, you can see there are various categories, different parts of the brain, like the limbic system is responsible for some emotional memory, fear response, and you know, you have the fight or flight reactions being triggered from this area of the brain. You have the nucleus accumbens. It's a pleasure center within the limbic system. It's active during pleasurable activities like, you know, eating or feeding, right? Sex, drug use, different things can activate that area. And they play a major role in addiction. So we'll kind of get into that a little bit more later. And the prefrontal cortex, the front part of the brain that is, you know, slowly developing, is another, you know, important part of the brain that we want to kind of address. It helps with executive functioning, impulse control. You know, you're organizing and planning tasks and all that because there's a, you know, healthy prefrontal cortex. So the kids, you know, sometimes they're not yet doing all those kind of organizing and planning very well because their prefrontal cortex is still not fully grown yet, you know? Not that they're not keeping on top of their classes, but they'll actually will be more impulsive and making some wrong decisions at those younger ages. And I want the parents to understand that this is just normal. And sometimes if they seem hyper, they're all over the place and they're not able to focus, things like that, Sometimes it could be related to this particular developmental stage that they're going through, but we have to kind of keep them in track and help them be organized. All right. So the next slide, this is a slide, as you can see, by adolescents, the nucleus accumbens, where dopamine is made and released and all that is more fully mature by that age, but the prefrontal cortex, the front part of the decision-making part of the brain, is not fully caught up to that developmental level, right, of the adult size where we want it to be. So because of that discrepancy itself, of that growth, we're going to see a lot of impulsive, poor decisions from kids. So we can't blame kids or others who are a little immature sometimes because of this particular reason. Let's look at the next slide, the drug use among youths, facts and statistics. So youth drug abuse is a high-profile public health concern, with at least 1 in 8 teenagers abusing an illicit substance in the last year. So these are some stats from the National Center of Drug Abuse and Statistics. 61%, how much drug use went up among 8th graders between 2016 and 2020. 62% of teenagers in the 12th grade have abused alcohol. 50% of teenagers have misused a drug at least once. And if you actually go into other websites like SAMHSA's website and all, we'll actually get much more detailed information of the youth survey studies that are done every 10 years or so. And during COVID, they didn't get a chance to do it, so we don't have the most updated data, but you'll see for like various mental illnesses and also substances, what's really happening within the population. And sometimes these numbers, don't do justice to understand everything. Moving to the next slide. So alcohol is by far the most commonly abused substance among teens and young adults. And I'll kind of save all this numbers and all, because it's not going to be as important, right? If it's not going to stick to you. But I really want to get to the meat of the presentation. But you can see, as far as like some of the numbers, it is an alarming set of numbers when it comes to all the different drugs, like the marijuana, cocaine, and marijuana being the highest, and then down the list goes everything else. We'll skip to the next slide. Here you can kind of see a little bit of a graphic in the next slide of how marijuana is like the most commonly abused among college students as well. And then cocaine, hallucinogens like mushrooms and other hallucinogens. And then you have ecstasy or mollies. Then you have the inhalants, methamphetamine, heroin, and then the fentanyl as well. So these are the different, drugs that are abused. Next, in this slide, how do alcohol, marijuana, vaping, prescription medications, and other drugs of abuse impact the developing adolescent brain, right? Is it going to be good? Is it going to be bad? We have to understand the science, right? Most of you will say it's going to be bad, I hope, right? And there are certain things when there are certain mental illnesses, we actually have to give certain medications to kind of help particular mental health issues, like, for example, ADHD and such, that are controlled medications that will help them function better. So we can have a discussion on that later, and I think Jacob will be presenting on ADHD later, but some of the points that I hit will also hit home a little bit. Next slide. And this is just a picture of a PET scan. On the left, you'll see a smaller scanning machine that can scan an animal for the animal studies, and then on the right side is like the big PET scan machine that's used for humans, right? And we can kind of look at how our particular cells in the brain is like metabolizing glucose, and how that is like the energy currency in the brain. So how glucose is getting metabolized will kind of tell us, it's like, oh, if I'm asking you to do something, this particular part of the brain is what's, taking care of it, right? So we're able to kind of make those connections and all that. Next slide. So we have these tools with medical imaging on that graph that very blue color picture. Below that it says, it's a 5-day-year-old infant, right? So the infant's brain is not fully developed, right? The connections aren't particularly fully developed. So you can see it's not very lit up. And the next slide is, the next middle graphic, come back to the previous slide. So the next middle graphic says, it's a 46-year-old and I think 6-year-old, sorry. And then the next one is of an adult, okay? So the 6-year-old's brain in that middle is very hyper-functioning if you look at it, right? All reds, yellow, and all that. And then as you get into adulthood, the same healthy person, right? Or another healthy person's brain is actually very calm, and you can see how it, kind of develops. So that's how it should look normally. And if somebody is given a certain function, it will light up, right? So light up as yellow or red and, such. We'll move to the next slide now. Now, for us to kind of understand this a little bit better, on the top area you can see a normal brain, and on the right side to that you see a person who's depressed, right? The depressed person's mental functioning is not going to be the same, and to understand that we have to kind of understand the different neurochemical things that are happening. So we would want to talk about the dopamine that's happening. That's one of the neurotransmitters, and that I'll be kind of concentrating on. Dopamine is released basically to kind of help us with movements, right? Like if I'm making hand gestures, I need a certain amount of dopamine from the particular part of the brain, right? Nucleus accumbens and such, and then it giving a signal to the motor part of the brain to kind of activate, the particular muscles that I need to do this function of opening and closing my hand. So it's for movements, and then if there are people who are novelty seekers, their particular brain, as you can see in the bottom picture between the normal control and a novelty seeker brain, it's pretty much much more lit up because they have a little bit more of the dopamine release and such. So they are adrenaline junkies in one sense, right? They live for these kind of high intensity moments and things like that. And then dopamine is also responsible for our well-being. It helps us with motivation, happiness, and things like that. It's a reward hormone, right, that we can kind of talk about. Also, it's the key hormone that's, because it works on the reward center, how it propagates addiction. So that's why, we'll be talking about it. So if I give you, some examples of how much dopamine increases, right, it'll kind of make it a little bit more clear. So let's say we all, take a test, right, and we pass a test. We feel good, right, if we get an A or something. And that type of feel-good feeling of getting that A or you pass the test and all that, it increases the dopamine level by 5 to 7%, right? And for adults, it may be oh, I got through the work week, whatever it is, right? And you're relaxing at home, and it may increase your dopamine level when you kind of feel rewarding. So that's normal. But let's say for somebody who is taking drugs, we have to kind of understand how much this dopamine level is going to spike, okay, to kind of better understand why this is a problem. So let's say we all kind of probably abuse one particular drug. Anybody know? We probably had it this morning. I think I heard it, right? Coffee, right? And there was tea as well, and I was offered some today. So I always have my 1 cup of coffee. I like it black. So anyway, that raises the dopamine level by 120%, okay? Now that's a big number, right? That's nothing. So cocaine, right, the actual drug, it raises it 300 to 400%. And then, again, it's dose dependent, all these things. If you have more coffee, obviously it's going to be more and such for cocaine. And heroin is 650 to 700,000. And methamphetamine, the most addictive and dangerous, 900,000, okay? So just to kind of put it in perspective, how these drugs can actually raise this addictive hormone in us, right? So next slide. So one of the things that we want to kind of understand is addiction a disease or not? Now, sometimes like even hearing addiction or somebody kind of going through a difficulty, let's say with alcohol, and they're addicted, and if they have alcoholism in the family or not, what do we tend to do? We sometimes like think, it's a moral weakness, or they're a bad person, they're morally bankrupt, they didn't do what they needed to do in life, and they messed up, whatever the reasons and things like we'll come up with, we may kind of judge it in the wrong way. But the notion that addiction is not a disease has handicapped our ability to advance science and even help the person with addiction. And now, until it kind of trickles down, so the medical community accepts it as a disease, and until also people accept it and understand it, people may not help the person struggling next to them. So that's why I want to kind of bring that out in front. And we hope to kind of understand addiction a little bit better in the next few slides. I'll try to speed up. So next slide. So we have enough data, good data, to show us, with the PET scans and different things, and I'll kind of go back to some of the scans again. So if one has more dopamine than you should for your age, the probability that you get addicted is 3 to 4 times higher if you try it, right? So those are the people who are adrenaline junkies, right? They may naturally have, or they're born with, that extra dopamine being released all the time, right? So they're always going to be like thrill seekers and all that. Then you have a second part of addiction to understand is that the disease of addiction is resident in the brain before anyone does anything addictive. So again, that novelty seeker, right? Until they actually start to do something that kind of triggered that extra dopamine release and that extra high feeling, they may not realize that they have that, higher dopamine level, being produced and all that. But once they start doing it, they are 3 to 4 times more likely to kind of get addicted to such behavior and such novelty seeking. So it is a disease that is unmasked when we simply go through the process of potentiating the system. So somebody who has, let's say, a family member who was, dealing with alcoholism, and then they had the child, not like they had the child and then they got into alcoholism, right? Because some of the things are passed down through our DNA. So somebody who's alcoholic who ends up having a kid, and sometimes this is something I wanted to bring up because nowadays with our community, I'm hearing a lot and even seeing our youths who are making good money in their good positions and all that. Yes, the problem with affluence has trickled down. They are partying and they're drinking all the time. I've had patients who've had DWI and ended up like losing their job and staying home, getting depressed, all these kind of things. But this problem is a prevalent problem, and we may actually see the consequences down the road. Some of these people may be hidden alcoholics. People I've heard complain about certain people, from young ladies to men as well, right? So it is an organic disease, and it is a problem to kind of be careful about. We don't want to get into this problem. We'll move to the next slide. Again, to kind of understand it better, we also have to kind of look at this particular picture of a normal brain activity, again on the left, but then let's say a person has an illness like ADHD, right? They have a little bit of a hypoactive brain, and obviously, they are going to be scattered and they're not going to pay attention well, things like that. For them, we may actually have to give the medication that increases dopamine, right? So there are different types of medications, and then when we increase it, they actually will look more normal, okay? So we'll actually get to that again a little bit later, but the next slide. So disease of addiction is an alteration of brain dopamine, either too much or too little, for example, right, in ADHD, can kind of perpetuate addiction. So for an ADHD patient, we saw that hypoactive brain, right? Let's say if they never came to treatment, the highest risk factor is also having that hypoactive brain, right? They can easily get into addiction. Why? Because they will eventually self-medicate, right? And when they self-medicate, they are going to, increase that dopamine level. It could be alcohol, it could be sometimes marijuana, different things that they may try as like a gateway drug to kind of self-medicate, and sometimes you see some increase in, dopamine levels because of those kind of abuse. Next slide. So now this is an interesting slide. Again, the normal person, when they take marijuana, as you can see, before marijuana is on the top left corner. And when they take marijuana, it just calms the brain down and relaxes, right? So again, when it comes to somebody older, again, when they're taking marijuana, it kind of relaxes their brain. So that's somebody on marijuana. Look at the right side. This a different person who is depressed, right? And this could be a teenager, adult. So the depressed person, when they take marijuana, it actually works sometimes to release all the dopamine, and actually they feel good because of that, right? Again, all these substances, any substance that we're going to talk about, it releases dopamine in that pathway, right? So they actually feel better. And so we as clinicians, sometimes we are told like, I'm not going to stop marijuana, and they're not going to take our advice and all that, but it's because of this principle. They themselves are self-medicating. Then we have to do a more education and such to kind of help them. Next slide. And to kind of hit the point a little bit more, caffeine studies, we all take caffeine, and you can see how the reward centers are lighting up, and these are the different, sections of the brain, the coronal, sagittal, and all that. And we can see how the nucleus accumbens, right, that we talked about is lighting up, and that's where, the dopamine is being released. So nucleus accumbens is the oldest part of the brain that makes you get what you want immediately. It directs you to get something that you need. When you're in danger, let's say, you may have to run away or seek shelter, right? Or seek safety, so you're going to do that. If you're thirsty, I want to get some water, I will do this, right? And it encodes the environment that you're in always. So let's say if you're in an environment where you are thrill-seeking. I got to finish that water. So yeah, so if you are in an environment where you're enjoying it with your friends and having a good time, it's not just about like that good times. It's also like all the cues in that environment that gets encoded in this particular part of the brain. And anytime that particular environment is triggered again, you may even have a craving. It's like, oh, let's have a drink here, So that's why you probably know that alcoholics are told, avoid people, places, and things that are common, right? Where you get triggered to, use alcohol with the person, or at a bar, at a place, or, things that also can trigger you. So environment is the reason for relapse, most cases with alcoholics. And it's important to kind of understand, and some people have actually benefited from understanding this particular concept, right? So in gambling environments, casinos, you have all the bells, lights, and whistles, right? And all the dinging and the music and all that. Why? Because once you go there a couple of times, you hear all this, you can actually, the nucleus accumbens can kind of, assimilate that information into the brain, and anytime you kind of, hear similar cues, you may want to gamble more. So if you end up hanging out there longer, it's actually going to be a problem that you can't get away from. All right? And it's just a reinforcement type thing that we're talking about. And we can kind of skip to this next slide. Oh, yeah. And again, it's the same, nucleus accumbens that's lighting up. And, they did various studies also on kids, who were asked to come in for the study. And they said they'll be allowed to use the internet to, watch or play and all that. Just the anticipation of it increases that. So while they're in the PET scan is when they give that information, right? That they will be allowed to use the internet and things like that. And that's live, information of dopamine being released from that particular part of the brain to kind of trigger excitement. And this is now replicated in other studies for other addictions as well, cell phones, et cetera, right? And moving to the next slide, similar type of information coming from looking into people who are given Monster drinks. I don't know if you know about that energy drink, right? Also has like a high level amount of caffeine. And just want to kind of bring this up because we have to kind of understand caffeine itself and the half-life of caffeine and how long it's in our system, right? So, and it kind of helps us to understand another concept when it comes to addiction. So 30 minutes after drinking Monster, right, the person's brain is kind of, lit up here, right? Now, caffeine kind of gives us like that kick and that alertness is similar, but, Monster may be a little bit stronger for that person. So the caffeine itself, when you measure it the next day, so the picture on the right is that same person, the next day, I think, right? And it's still lit up, if you can see, right? It should be actually even calmer, but it's still lit up. It's slowly kind of, leaving the system. So the time course, when they looked at the brain, for each different addictive substance that we talked about earlier, it's different half-lives. So with alcohol, a couple of drinks and all that will actually only reset you to a normal brain level, like, that's kind of getting to the normal. Will only get to the normal level in 6 to 7 days. But an alcoholic is drinking every day, right? So anyway, this is another thing with college kids and binge drinking, right? Every week, they're ending up like at the weekends drinking and things like that, and they are always kind of suffering the consequences. So that for that 6 days, their functioning will be impaired in some way or the other, right? It'll be decreased focusing or, having trouble with medical type of things that could be going on. Obviously it's bad for your liver, it's bad for, like you get dehydrated and different things like that. Obviously there's more dangers we can kind of talk about in itself, but, it kind of snowballs on its own, right? So different drugs, it kind of lasts longer and we're never like fully away from the particular drug that we're using before they use it again. So when they looked at it, even for caffeine, if you drink coffee, how long does it last for you to stay wide awake and alert? Some people are taking the second drink already after a few hours, right? Because they already feel tired, right? So if you can think about it, it's still in your system if you measure it. But if you have a second drink of coffee, again, you're kind of double dosing now. Even though the coffee's in the system, the brain has kind of found a way to survive in one sense by not being in that stimulated mode, right? The brain always resets to like a baseline. Even though that drug is still in the system, the brain is resetting, so you're now feeling tired and things like that, and we think it's a caffeine crash or a sugar crash, whatever it may be, but actually the brain is actually resetting to a more baseline level, and then we are drinking more. And this happens for alcohol, everything. So even though the alcohol is still in your system, people are already reaching for the second drink and then, third drink, etc. So just to kind of bring that point to the picture. So we can kind of skip this next slide, repeated use, right? This is what I was kind of hinting at. We can go into the next slide. And caffeinated alcohol. I don't know how much of you know about Four Loko and how people drink certain drinks like Red Bull and vodka, those kind of drinks. the principle is like when caffeine is in the bloodstream and crosses the blood-brain barrier, it kind of changes its the structure, right? Where it makes alcohol seep into the brain easily. So with less alcohol, you can get easily drunk on those kind of mixed drinks. And somebody marketed it, and they did well, right? So with just one drink, they're getting, the buzz and all that. So next slide, we'll see the smoker. We have to kind of understand, that smoking also does a different thing when it comes to addiction, right? So in this PET scan, they're actually, in PET scans, they also kind of get this image because they have these radio labeled like isotope that's kind of given in the bloodstream, and that's what's lighting it up. So when we look at glucose, we can look for that. When we want to look at dopamine, we can label it and, look for that particular thing. So there are different types of dopamine receptors. We can even look specifically like that. This one is actually looking at monoamine oxidase. It's one of those enzymes that break down dopamine. So when you look at the monoamine study here, the MAO or monoamine oxidase, right, keeps dopamine from elevating usually. It's usually an enzyme that kind of, recycles dopamine by breaking it down and, getting rid of it. So when a smoker is smoking, his monoamine oxidase is actually much less, right? This is normal, and then the smoker's monoamine oxidase is much less. So if that enzyme is less, what is happening? Dopamine can get real high in the brain, right? Now, this could be a person with ADHD that started smoking, right? And he self-medicated himself and picked up smoking and things like that. So like that, there are, various other reasons as well, but there are people who are self-medicating their ADHD or different types of particular issues, or they just do this and, they have this particular brain where dopamine is high and they feel good, or they feel, things are working well for them, or happy, or whatever they feel. I don't know the feeling, right? But anyway, smoking reduces one of these enzymes, right? That's the main thing to kind of, take home with you. Next slide. So obviously there's a dose effect also that we want to understand. So from moving from left to right, before smoking, the brain looks normal. And after one puff, 3 puff, 1 cigarette is done, and 3 cigarettes, all the MAO, right, all those enzymes are kind of shut down. So now, this is a slide, I put it up there also to bring up the other point, secondhand smoking, right? Nowadays, kids go to parties and they don't smoke, but they're sitting there in that environment. And within 90 minutes, the person who's getting just the secondhand smoke will end up like down in that road as well, as if they smoked 2-3 cigarettes. So that's important to understand. So if you are even exposed to secondhand smoking, or if somebody smokes at your home, they have to go outside. That's why all these laws and all these recommendations are being made, right? Because there's science behind all this. So we can move to the next slide. We kind of swing back to the alcohol in this next slide, where we can kind of look at, when we are sober, somebody's over there. Can move to the next slide. Yeah, thanks. So a sober brain, right? And then intoxicated brain, right? How it kind of has calmed down. So again, we're bringing this up also because it helped us understand the time concept like we talked about, right? Caffeine takes 24 to 36 hours to kind of return our brain to like normal metabolic level and all that. Alcohol takes that 5 to 7 days. We talked about that. And during this time, we get metabolically like blunted, right? In one sense. And the brain is like hypometabolic as we can see it, like not functioning to its best capacity. So it takes more energy to learn, more energy to focus, all these kind of things. So it's really bad for students and anybody who would use alcohol and have to go to work or, even study different things, right? All right, moving on to the next slide, right? This particular slide related to alcohol again. As you can see on the left is the normal subject where brain is normal. In the middle one is the 54-year-old alcoholic. And usually when we look at, they're all similar age. So the left one is like a 51-year-old male. The second one is like a 54-year-old alcoholic. And then the next one is also of an alcoholic male who's actually drunk. So the middle one is actually a person who was alcoholic and has been sober for 20 years. So they found in studies that a lot of the brain functions as alcohol kills brain cells. It kind of has damaged the brain so much, and that's one of the points everybody should understand from this. All these different drugs do its damages, and it's not really reversible, right? So this person, even though they're sober for 20 years, it's like a hypofunctioning brain in the middle, right? So when they drink, or if you give an alcoholic person, or if you ask an alcoholic person, why did you drink? It's like, I just want to be normal, right? And they feel normal after getting drunk. So their brain becomes like hyperactive again, or normal, actually. So it's a positive feedback loop that we see here. And so that's another thing. Sometimes alcoholics are not trying to just continue the habit. They just want to feel normal. Otherwise, they feel depressed in that hypofunctioning brain. They're not going to be able to, do what they need to do and perform everything. So this kind of positive feedback loop is very hard to treat. So we want to kind of educate people to never get into a problem with alcohol. Next slide. We'll kind of skip through this, long-term effects of marijuana. I'll kind of just mention a quick tidbit. Marijuana use is increased in adolescence. It does arrest the frontal, cortex, prefrontal cortex of the brain. As you can see the image of the two lit up areas. So when it arrests the frontal lobe development, your executive functionings, all these different things are going to be poor, right? We have looked at studies that show that, there's increased rate of dropouts from high school and colleges and all that when the teen has started early. So the earlier you start using, the more the risk. And then there's more severe versions of it, K2 or Spice, all these kind of synthetic cannabis that are out there that works a little bit different. And because they're synthetic and they work through different mechanisms to cut off oxygen saturation in the brain, they actually get you higher quick. And when they get you higher quick, the dopamine levels are too high, and they sometimes present to us like paranoid and psychotic, right? Confused, agitated, all that. Moving to the next slide. This is a little interesting about Molly. So Molly, or ecstasy, right? That's the other name for it. So ecstasy works in a different way. It kills off serotonin cells, right? In the brainstem. So brainstem is where the serotonin cells are made in the raphe nucleus and all that. And when serotonin levels are starting to drop, you get depressed. And then we have to, again, treat them with SSRIs or different medications and all that when they come to us. But again, it may not be as effective because they're actually killing off a lot of the serotonin, cells. So, and the medication itself is not a serotonin supplement, right? So there's like more to this. And this happens to be one of the most common reasons for increased suicide rate among high school students, because ecstasy-induced depression is becoming more and more prevalent. And we won't get into other medical issues with that. We can skip the next slide and jump here. This is the most addictive one. Just wanted to kind of show you, the methamphetamine, and then the next slide. Of a picture of a normal girl and her brain versus a person on methamphetamine, and how they've destroyed all the brains, right? And then I'll stop here with the last slide here. Which brain do you want, right? And this image, kind of shows you of, the healthy user all the way in the top left, the top part of the brain, and then the bottom part of the brain, which is, healthy underside of the brain is how they show it. And then how 4 years of marijuana causes some damage, 4 years of smoking causes a certain level of damage, 6 years of opiates cause damage, 4 years of cocaine, 10 years of alcohol, or 3 years of meth all the way on the left. As you can see, it's like a 3D image of certain PET scans and all that. So there's certainly a lot of damage happening. I want you guys to kind of understand that drugs, can actually cause significant damage that's irreversible. And after all the problems, and sometimes they come to us to help them, oh, so-and-so is this and that. Sometimes it's just, we can only help so much. We can only maintain certain symptoms from getting worse and all that. And we are actually helpless because you already did the damage. We can't just replace, and then the brain cells aren't really growing back to heal those things like other organs can heal in certain ways. So, there is a big issue there. The rest of the slides is more related to like how we kind of deal one-on-one and, diagnose and screeners and different things that we do in a clinical setting, but I'll stop here and save your questions, and we can kind of dive into the next topic. Thank you for your time. Sorry it took so long.
Thank you, Dr. Chaco. That was actually very insightful and very helpful. Thank you so much for presenting on the topic of addiction. Next, we will hear from Dr. Shireen Thomas, who is a general psychiatrist working for VITA Guidance Center and also at their satellite clinic through Urban Health Plan. She also works part-time at Montefiore Medical Center's emergency room. Dr. Thomas will present on the topic of marriage and counseling. Thank you so much.
Good evening, everyone. I'm so sorry, just one second. Okay. All right, so today I've got the privilege and honor of speaking to everyone on marriage and relationships. Particularly what I focused on was ways to maintain and flourish meaningful relationships. And similar to what Dr. Chaco just did, I'm gonna try to approach this with an academic background. So in terms of what you see listed, the majority of things are things that we have picked up from studies and research on multiple couples and marriages over a span of decades, and from different studies that have been conducted and systematic reviews. So hopefully I can inform and provide some information on these different types of coping strategies and markers and so on. So for the next slide, so here's an overview of today's presentation, just a brief definition on types of relationships, markers of unhealthy relationships, markers of healthy relationships, maintenance warnings. Recently had a car issue, and I just thought that was a great analogy as to those little, signals that we get on our car dashboard. It's a really great sign sometimes for checking in on what's going on. Patterns of healthy marriages and tools for maintenance. Next slide. Okay. So, per Cambridge Dictionary, relationships are defined as the way in which two or more people feel and behave towards each other. So really, that's a very general description to describe a lot of relationships, anywhere from our familial relationships, friendships, romantic partners, coworkers, classmates, business partners, and so on. So these markers that I'm going to be discussing are, I hope, are markers that we can apply to many different areas of our lives. And I hope that, as we look at these markers, it can be used to help us to reflect on our own behaviors and work on trying to identify and change those behaviors with the goals of hoping to empower us to enrich and transform our relationships. So next slide. Okay, so what are some markers of unhealthy relationships? So I'm gonna review all of these, but I'm going to go into depth into maybe 3 of them, and if there's any questions, more than happy to take it up during the Q&A. So lack of effective communication and emphasis on effective communication, right? We can scream, yell, sometimes passive-aggressively express our needs and wants, but there's effective ways to do so. Violation of boundaries, lack of respect, sometimes seen through sarcastic or demeaning humor. Pace and intensity of relationships, isolation, extreme jealousy, and turbulence. So just to go into a couple of these different markers, what does turbulence look like? And again, this could be in familial, friendships, marriages, and it's pretty much any time where, the highs are real high and the lows are real low. So it could be where two best friends can have a really intense fight and they think that they're not going to be friends anymore, and then the next day they resolve their issue and they're like, oh my gosh, you're going to be my best friend for another 20 years. Or it could be relationships, right, where, a partner thinks that, like, this is completely over, I hate you, I can't see your face anymore. 2 days later, they're like, oh, baby, I'm going to marry you and be with you for the rest of my life, right? Now, where it gets concerning, though, is where, one of the greatest expressions of love is honestly seen when we get into fights. How we respect and how we treat our loved ones, when we're most angry and upset with them, that is one of the greatest expressions of love. So if we can still respect, if we can still love on the people that are in our lives when we're most upset, most disappointed, most hurt by them, that is one of the best ways for us to show love to them during those moments. Violation of boundaries, it doesn't have to be that someone says directly, no, this is not something I want. Sometimes people could just say as much as, I don't really want to do this. And unfortunately, in our community, sometimes we can interpret this as, well, they don't really want to spend time with me, they don't really like me, they don't really enjoy my presence. But rather, most of the times when boundaries are placed, it's really to protect that relationship. It's meant to safeguard what is developing in that relationship, whether that's in a familial, friendship, or in a romantic relationship. Jealousy, that is a natural component of relationships. I'm sure those of us who have had meaningful friendships and whatnot, when you see your best friend hanging out with a new friend, you're like, who's that new person? Or, when you're siblings and, that hate-love relationship, but like when you see them hanging a lot more with another person, you're like, well, who's my sister or my brother talking to, and are they going to take my place? However, there's an extreme level of that, though, where, it comes out as anger outbursts, threatening behaviors, desperate behaviors, and that's where it becomes much more of a concern in a relationship. And just to go into another one that I think, can be sometimes misinterpreted, lack of respect, it shows up in different ways, and that's why I wanted to go into humor. And this is something, I hope that, like, from this slide, we can all identify something that we all can either tend to do in a lot of our relationships. I can definitely state that, for a majority of times, making fun of our siblings, our loved ones, our parents, our partners, in ways that, or we're just joking around or we're playing with them. However, does it come off as sarcastic? Are we putting them down? Are we demeaning them? And that's another marker of, are we really respecting the people that we love in our lives, or are we actually bringing them down? Next slide. So what are some markers then of healthy relationships? So one of the best definitions that I picked up in one of these studies is that love is the investment in the well-being of the other for his or her own sake. So this is where we will pour into the lives of the people that we love, that we care for, not with any type of transactional or a type of record-keeping manner, however, with a generosity that I mentioned as a later bullet point of love for that person, so that we just pour into them just to see them grow. And that's another marker of a healthy relationship, where you actually help each other grow. It ends up being what we call in our biology textbooks a symbiotic relationship, helping one another to grow, to flourish. And you actually, one of the signs that you can see as that is an increased confidence. Your partner ends up being greater at what they're doing. Your sibling, your brother, your sister, your parent ends up being a better version of themselves because of their relationship with you, and vice versa. Gratitude for one another, open lines of communication, respect, genuine efforts to understand each other's love languages. Now, what does that look like? So hopefully, I can list out the 5 love languages. Hopefully most of you know: words of affirmation, quality time, acts of service, physical touch, and gift giving. And again, in the beginning, our loved ones might have certain types of love languages, which might change over time, which is why ongoing curiosity is essential for relationships, especially when our friends who we knew in high school, college, they might have very different likes, dislikes 10 years later, or they might have very similar ones. But it's this ongoing curiosity to want to learn about them, to know them, to continue to studying them and understanding them that helps us to keep loving them and to have healthy relationships with them. And particularly, that's where that ongoing curiosity in relationships really comes in key. And commitment, knowing that at the end of the day that after we're done fighting with our brother or our sister, our parent, our like your husband or wife, knowing that at the end of the day they're going to come back to you because they care about you, they want to be with you, they want to continue working on the relationship. It almost gives a secure sense of attachment. And that's something actually that is spoken about in different types of therapy, where when you know that someone is committed to you and you know that they're going to continue returning to you, it gives you a sense of safety in that relationship. And self-care is also another important component of a healthy relationship. Being able to take that time and space to take care of yourself and having the freedom to do so, the space to do so, it actually also continues to help you to have healthy relationships in different spheres of life. Next slide. So what are some maintenance signals in marriages? So, I think we've often heard that sometimes we hear, I hate you, yeah, I don't love you anymore. And quite frankly, hatred is not the opposite of love. It's indifference. When we get to a point where we do not care, when we get to a point where there is no strong emotion for that loved one and we're just indifferent, there's no emotion there, that's a huge signal that things need to be worked upon. Violation of boundaries, as I had mentioned before, disrespect, boredom. And this is where, and I mentioned boredom for a specific reason. I do believe that our marriages specifically, and I have the privilege of speaking to a church community today, specifically about boredom. God has called us to live lives that honor Him, that worship Him, glorify Him. So in our marriages, if it gets to a place of boredom, then we gotta do a bit of reflecting and see, are we really challenging ourselves? Are we too complacent or comfortable where we are? Or are we challenging ourselves to be a married couple or to be a family or even, a community that serves God, that challenges ourselves and gets ourselves outside of a complacent, boring place? Or is every day a challenge for us where we challenge ourselves to put ourselves outside of our comfort zone for the sake of others and for the sake of God's kingdom? And another maintenance signal, lack of communication, dysfunction leading into other areas of life. Are the fights that you're having within your marriage going and bleeding into other areas? Is it affecting you at your workplace? Is it affecting you with your children? Is it affecting you with your friendships? And so that's another signal that there needs to be room for work and for reflection. And the Gottman Institute had come up with 4 particular destructive behaviors that they found from thousands of couples that were studied. Multiple marriages, some of them that led to divorce and some of them that stayed together. And they were able to come up with a 90% certainty based on these 4 destructive behaviors if couples would end up getting divorced. And I don't know if we're able to click on that link, but if we are, okay, maybe not. All right, no worries. So I'll just, wait, is that it? That's an ad. Okay, cool. If we can, is there audio for that link? We can play it. AV team, you guys are awesome. Thank you for doing this. If we're not able to do it, I'll go ahead and explain it to you guys in the meantime. give it a minute. So the 4 destructive behaviors that are discussed, and no worries, guys, if you guys can't do it, you can just give me a thumbs down if you're not. Okay, thank you. All right, so the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse that are discussed is criticism, defensiveness, contempt, and stonewalling. So criticism, hopefully that's self-explanatory. Defensiveness, when your partner comes up to you and says, hey, listen, you really hurt me with this behavior. It's saying, nah, that's all you. You're being sensitive. You're being too much. You're just hallucinating that I did these things. That's a form of defensiveness, right? Now here's the thing. You may not be responsible for all of the things that your partner is saying, and that's where that conversation needs to take place. However, there might be some partial responsibility that you might play in that role. And so that's what defensiveness would be. Contempt, and this was interesting, and this is something that I also want to explain a little bit more. It's where we belittle our partner and try to express and create superiority over our partner by putting them down, creating sarcastic comments, creating jokes that belittle them and put them down and make them feel lesser. And that actually is one of the most destructive behaviors out of the first 3. And stonewalling is interestingly what happens when all 3 of these behaviors continue in a relationship, and especially in a marriage. One of the partners will end up, and I think the most contemporary term that can be used to explain this behavior is probably what we call as, the quote-unquote silent treatment. It's where it comes out of is when the partner feels overwhelmed or inundated by what's going on, and they just shut down. And they can't really return to the conversation. They have a hard time or a difficult time returning to that relationship. And so, again, both partners play a role in all of these behaviors. And the best way to get to it is by each partner recognizing what behaviors that they're creating and bringing to the table and doing their best efforts to minimize, work on those behaviors, and to actually do the opposite of those behaviors. So what are patterns of healthy, do we have the video? Okay, awesome, all right, I think we'll.
You're so selfish.
What an idiot.
It's not my fault we're always late.
Forget it.
Criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. Dr. John Gottman calls these negative communication patterns the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse because they'll lead to the end of your relationship. In fact, he can predict this relationship failure with over 90% accuracy if the behavior isn't changed. So, what can you do? Well, at the Gottman Institute, we understand you might not even know you're communicating this way, or you might not know how to control it. But if you practice the following 4 research-based antidotes, there is hope for your future. Criticism attacks the character of the recipient, instead of focusing on a specific behavior. The antidote to criticism is to talk about your feelings using I statements, then express a positive need. Contempt is an expression of superiority that comes out as sarcasm, cynicism, name-calling, eye-rolling, sneering, mockery, and hostile humor. Contempt is the greatest predictor of relationship failure and must be eliminated. The antidote to contempt is to treat one another with respect and build a culture of appreciation within the relationship. Defensiveness is self-protection through righteous indignation or playing the victim. Defensiveness never solves the problem and is really just an underhanded way of blaming your partner. The antidote to defensiveness is to accept responsibility, even if only for part of the conflict. Stonewalling occurs when the listener withdraws from the conversation without resolving anything. It takes time for the negativity created by the first 3 horsemen to result in stonewalling, but when it does, it can become a habit. The antidote to stonewalling is to break for at least 20 minutes, calm down, then return to the conversation. Spare your relationship from certain destruction. Learn more about eliminating the 4 horsemen by visiting our site.
So it is a great resource to check out, and they've got a lot of free videos on that website as well. So great. If we can go to patterns of healthy marriage. Oh, thank you guys. Okay. So what are some patterns of healthy marriages? So I've been to a lot of premarital conferences, especially in our church system, and a lot of I remember one of the main concepts that I would often hear is keeping God at the center. And I would always be like, great, we can work on that now. What does that look like? And I remember asking pragmatically, what does keeping God at the center look like for a marriage? And, some of the things that I think help a couple, and especially a husband and wife, to grow together is praying together, learning together, serving together. And these are pragmatic steps of keeping God at the center, along with many more. And I also approach this topic with the utmost humility because, again, all of these things are things that I think even on an individual basis we're all working on. And some other patterns, and out of those three that I just listed, praying together is actually something that has been researched, and it's actually been found to decrease the risk of divorce amongst couples. And the rationalization that they've come about it is that the act of praying together creates a sense of compassion, respect, even helps to create that environment for forgiveness, healing between two couples when they genuinely pray together. Having shared goals and dreams, being able to foster that sense of working together as a team, being plugged into a faith-based community, a community that helps to hold you accountable, challenges you, just as iron sharpens iron. And there was a good quote that said, couples who are most successful at keeping their relationship alive over the years, there's a component of companion love and an element of passionate love. And I'm sure with the marriages that, we've been able to find and look up to, you almost see that, the two couples that have grown together over the years, you can almost see that there is this deep friendship. And it's not that the husband and wife or two partners have to be each other's best friends. It's the very trait that they're just this deep found of friendship between them. And then there's also a deep sense of love between the two of them. And so it's this fluctuating sense of passion and friendship where, they have these bouts of, passionate form of love between them and a deep sense of friendship between the two of them as well. Having quality time and turning towards each other. And I'll go into what turning towards each other looks like in the next slide. And another quote that a study had come as during their discussion and a way to encompass the highlighting points was that when couples stick together through difficult times, remain faithful to one another, and continuously work to resolve problems, positive long-term outcomes, while not guaranteed, are common. So when two individuals, two partners, husband and wife, are working together as a team, you work on creating conflict resolution together. You come up with ways to work together. You put aside your differences and you bring your strengths together, and you find ways of actually bolstering up each other's weaknesses and turning it into strengths. And another component that I wanted to highlight was that trust is often a basic component of relationships. However, when that trust becomes into a faith that two people have in each other, that two partners have in each other, especially when out of that commitment, out of time, out of knowing that this person is going to work with me, they're going to be with me, there's a faith that almost develops. And there's a faith that comes from knowing that that person and that sense of security has developed with that person, of knowing that that person is going to be there to work with me. And that faith ends up being a healthy pattern of marriages. So next slide, please. Thank you, guys. So when the maintenance signals come up, and even if we've tried to foster these healthy patterns, there are times that we need a more professional support, another source of assistance in our marriages, in our relationships. And it's not a sign of weakness to be able to incorporate that extra support or that extra guidance. And really, the best time to have couples therapy, the best time to incorporate therapy into relationships is really when it's actually going well. And even if it's going well, there are rooms for growth. And unfortunately, most of the times that couples go to therapy, it is when the maintenance signals start coming up, and that's just as fine. Being able to be going to couples therapy when those maintenance signals come up, that's great, because that's even before things have gotten harder to work through. And the reason why I bring up these different forms of therapy is just to highlight that there are multiple different ways of working through a partnership, of working through a marriage. And Gottman's couples therapy, that was just the video that I had shown all of you. CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, it's looking at how the thoughts and the narratives that we build up in our minds about relationships, the way that relationships should be, how that can affect the very mechanisms, dynamics, and behaviors within our relationships. Imago relationship therapy, very similar to also narrative therapy, where we have particular images that we've cultivated since our childhood about what relationships should look like. They're not always positive ones. And so unfortunately, subconsciously or consciously, we tend to emulate these images and even project them into our current relationships. So it's being able to look at this and being able to understand where these images are coming from. How are we now emulating these images into our current relationships, and how is it coming out in the current dynamic with my partner? Solution-focused therapy, it's much more at a particular problem and a specific issue that's coming up between two couples. Relational life therapy, I thought this was interesting. This is looking at how in a marriage or in a relationship, people will pick up particular roles due to that are picked up from society or culture, and how we tend to be ingrained in those roles that society or culture has created for us, and sometimes how that it might impede in our ability to flourish or grow in our relationship because we're so stuck in the roles that we have constricted our minds to, in terms of this is what one partner is supposed to do, this is what another partner is supposed to do. And discernment counseling is another form of counseling, and this is the last type of counseling where if there's one partner, it's pretty much where two people are ambiguous about whether a marriage is going to last or it's going to end. And so in relation to that, that's pretty much where if one partner is confused about whether a marriage is going to end, it's a way to help the couple come to the same page about either ending the relationship or continuing with the relationship. And next slide, thank you. So this was a quote that, sometimes I think, especially when from what I've heard from couples who have been in marriages for decades, it's not that, marriage does look hard, it sounds hard, and, from the marriages that I have been given the privilege to be witnesses to, it's not easy work at the end of the day, and it does take a lot of effort and time and lots of reflection, and we all know that, a lot of divine intervention is also needed. And the beautiful part of being able to put in that work, that time and effort, is that contrary to what many people think, marital quality does not inevitably decline. It tends to remain high or even improve over the decades. So it's something that ends up, at the end of the day, that only helps two people to grow together. It helps two people to become the greatest versions of themselves because they continue to sharpen each other, challenge each other, and to help each other grow, God willingly, in their relationship with God and in their relationship with others. And so that being said, I also do want to give the other side of the coin is also when two people have to work together. However, if there's one partner who continues to exhibit unhealthy patterns, or there's one partner that is not working in that marriage, and one partner that's refusing to put in that work and that effort, and then there's only one partner that's actually working and striving, and after prayerful guidance, professional guidance, there are times that, where God has also called us to allow for certain doors to be closed. And I think those are times also that we do need to seek out prayerful guidance and professional guidance to help us and to guide us in those decision-making processes as well. So, there are times that where knowing who we are in Christ helps us to also know of what decisions and what steps that we must take to also honor who we are called to be in Christ as well. And that being said, the last slide has some references for what I discussed about, and more than happy to take some questions at the end of our presentation. And thank you all for your time and attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thomas. Thank you so much for talking about marriage and counseling. We will now hear from Dr. Jessie Kurian, who is an advanced practice nurse. She has a doctorate as a nurse practitioner. She's a full-time faculty member at Northwell's Zucker Hillside Inpatient Unit. She specializes in working with the adult population, along with perinatal and geriatric individuals. In addition, she has a private practice in the community. Dr. Kurian will present on the topic of mood disorders, and after she speaks, we will take a 5-minute break, and you can use that time to start writing down any questions you may have. If you need an index card, they're behind the pews. If you need pens, just raise your hand during those 5 minutes. All right, thank you. So Dr. Jessie Kurian will come up.
Thank you for inviting me to speak today on mood disorder. So, what is mood disorder? So some of the old diagnostic and statistic manuals, otherwise known as what we use in psychiatry as DSM, used to refer to these disorders as affective disorders as well. Mood disorder is preferable, as mood disorders are sustained emotional states. They are known as syndromes, consisting of a cluster of signs and symptoms sustaining over weeks to months. Sorry, next slide. But those are some objectives. Next slide. They're known as syndromes, consisting of a cluster of signs and symptoms sustaining over weeks to months, which usually departing from a person's habitual functioning, and they tend to recur, often in cyclical fashion. Moods can be normal, elevated, or even depressed. In normal moods, you experience a wide array of emotions, and the person is in control of their mood. However, in mood disorder, that sense of control is lost, and the person verbalizes a feeling of distress. Next slide. So I'll be going over depressive disorders and bipolar disorders. Next slide. So you have your depressive disorders, major depressive disorders, and dysthymic. Next slide, please. So what are your bipolar disorders? You have bipolar 1, bipolar 2, and cyclothymic disorder. Next slide. So major depressive disorder. What is major depressive disorder? You have depressed mood most of the day, nearly every day, as indicated by either a subjective report of feeling sad, empty, hopeless, or symptoms observed by others, appearing tearful, unmotivated, or even disheveled, like they're not taking care of their appearance. And it's a markedly decreased interest in all or almost all activities, whether they subjectively tell you or objectively you notice objectively if you notice some, on their appearance. It's usually a decrease or an increase in appetite. In children, consider failure to gain weight. Other symptoms include insomnia, hypersomnia, or increased sleeping like 12 to 15 hours nearly daily. You see a psychomotor agitation or psychomotor retardation, which is like restlessness or being slowed down. Other symptoms include fatigue or feelings of worthlessness. Next slide, please. Other symptoms also include guilt, and which guilt can sometimes be delusional in nature, and I've seen that great deal in your postpartum women. Poor concentration, decreased ability to think, you can't make decisions, patients asking the same questions over and over again. recurrent thoughts of death, suicidal ideation, with or without a specific plan, or a suicide attempt, or a specific plan for committing suicide. Next slide. Major depressive episode diagnosis. In order to be diagnosed as having a major depressive disorder, you need to have 5 or more of the symptoms have to be present during a 2-week period. And there is a change in functioning, such as not being able to work. And one of the symptoms must be a depressed mood, or anhedonia, which is a loss of interest or pleasure in the things you used to enjoy or like to do. Next slide. In these situations, the loss includes symptoms of intense sadness, ruminations about the loss, insomnia, poor appetite, and weight loss. And these symptoms may appear similar to symptoms of loss. However, consideration to major depressive disorder should be considered. So one should evaluate based on the clinical judgment and absolutely consider culture as well, especially looking at responses to loss. And we're going to have a presentation on grief and loss a little later. And other diagnoses such as schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, delusional disorders, and other psychotic disorders are also considered. Next slide. So dysthymia, what is dysthymia? So you have depressed mood for most of the day for at least 2 years. And you have to have presence of 2 or more of the following symptoms: poor appetite or overeating, insomnia, hypersomnia, which is increased sleeping, low energy, fatigue, low self-esteem, poor concentration, or difficulty making decisions, and feelings of hopelessness. Next. So dysthymia, like I said, during the 2-year period, the patient has never been without symptoms for more than 2 months at a time. And there is no manic or hypomanic episodes, which I'll get into a little later. And symptoms are not caused by substances. And the major depressive symptoms are continuously present for years. And symptoms are not explained by other diagnoses. Symptoms cause a great impairment in social and your occupational areas of functioning. Next. So what comes to your mind when you hear bipolar disorder? Next. In order to meet the criteria for bipolar 1 disorder, one has to meet the criteria for a manic episode. So what is included in mania? Manic episode may have preceded by and may be followed by hypomanic or major depressive episodes. Hypomania we'll get to. So for manic episode to be there, so you can have a persistently elevated, expansive, irritable mood, persistently increased goal-directed activity lasting at least 1 week. So during the mood disturbance, there is an increased energy, and 3 or more of the following symptoms have to be present. You have to have an inflated self-esteem or grandiosity, decreased need for sleep. Usually the patient or whoever is there the client is more talkative than usual or pressured to keep talking. There's flight of ideas or complaints of racing thoughts. Often one is distracted. There's an increase in goal-directed activity, engaging in risky behaviors like gambling, etc. And these risky behaviors have potential for negative consequences, like they engage in increased spending sprees, even sexual indiscretions or unwise business investments. Next. And the mood disturbance causes significant impairment in social or occupational functioning. And please note that a manic episode that arises from antidepressant treatment, for example, even medications, electroconvulsive therapy, which persists at a full syndromal level beyond the physiological effect of treatments, is really evidence for mania as well. according to the DSM. Next. So let's talk about hypomanic episode. Hypomania is a persistently elevated, expansible, irritable mood, persistently increased goal-directed activity, lasting at least 4 consecutive days. So you have mania, which is great elevation, and hypomania is a little bit lower, and it only lasts 4 days or so. And during this mood disturbance as well, and there is increased energy, 3 of the following have to be there too, like increased self-esteem or grandiosity, like they think they're God, or they're talking about, recently we had a patient who said he has $2 million in the bank, and we really have to verify some of these things. Or decreased need for sleep, more talkative than usual, or this pressure to keep talking. They can't be interrupted. Flight of ideas, or complaints of racing thoughts, distractibility, increase in goal-directed activity, and engaging in risky behaviors. Next. And the hypomanic episode is also associated with a change in their functioning as well. And it's really not characteristics of that individual. And if you see psychosis, more than likely you're seeing mania. So it's a mood disturbance and change in functioning observable by others. So an individual with bipolar disorder, they go through a cycling of depression and mania. And the depressive episode usually in bipolar disorder is more severe than that of depressive disorder. So that so those of you in primary care may get a patient who comes in with depression symptoms, and oftentimes you have to ask the question, have you experienced mania? Because what often happens is, we see a great deal, is that they're prescribed an antidepressant, and lo and behold, they're in full-blown mania at times. Next. So bipolar II disorder. So for a diagnosis of bipolar II disorder, you have to meet the following criteria for a current or past hypomanic episode, and the criteria for current or past major depressive disorder. So, and bipolar II disorder, there is no manic episode, and hypomania is not explained by schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, delusional disorder. And the frequent occurrences of hypomania and depression cause impairment in your social or occupational functioning. Next. Psychothymic disorder is, for at least 2 years, the individual has an hypomanic and depressive symptoms which do not meet criteria for either hypomanic episode or depressive disorder. So, and usually this lasts 2 years. In children, you see it lasts 1 year. Next. So what are some causes of major depressive disorders? So according to Mayo Clinic, it's not known exactly what causes depressive disorders. There's many factors that are involved. So biological, there's significant changes in brain, extent of the changes as the first presenter, Dr. Chaco, had mentioned some things. The extent of the changes actually is unknown. Brain chemistry, let's talk about neurotransmitters. Are natural chemicals in the brain, so research has indicated that changes in these functions and effect of these neurotransmitters in the circuitry of the brain do play a role in depression, as the serotonin, and you have your serotonin and norepinephrine, and so as I'll discuss later, many of these medications kind of affect the serotonin and the norepinephrine. Hormones, changes in body's balance of hormones play a role in triggering depression. Hormone changes in pregnancy and postpartum, and even thyroid patients and menopause. So in menopause, you have a decrease in estrogen and progesterone, and they can trigger mood swings. In the insomnia in menopause can also trigger depression. Traits. Depression is very common among blood relatives and that have the condition, and researchers are trying to find the genes involved. According to the NIH, MRI studies support like a reduced brain volume orbitofrontal cortex, and decrease in hippocampus, putamen, and caudate nucleus. These are brain structures, and they do see actually gray matter loss. And they say it has to do with increased cortisol impeding like brain cell growth. And these are changes that they do notice in depression. Next. Okay. Actually, go back one. Yeah. So what are some risk factors for major depression? Low self-esteem, dependency, self-critical, pessimistic, trauma, such as physical and sexual abuse, death of a loved one, financial problems, or being in a tumultuous relationship, blood relative with a history of depression, bipolar disorder, alcoholism, or suicide, being lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender in an unsupportive situation, serious illness such as cancer, stroke, pain, or heart disease, medications. Please, so before you stop any medications, you should be discussing with your providers. Some do have side effects of, some may cause depression. Next. Causes of bipolar disorder. Biological, it appears to have physical changes in brain, which is extent is unknown. And genetics, bipolar disorder is more common in people with first-degree relatives, such as siblings or parents. And researchers are trying to find genes that may be involved in causing bipolar disorder. Next. Family history. Having first-degree relatives, such as parent or sibling with bipolar disorder. Periods of high stress, such as death of a loved one or a traumatic event. And drug and alcohol use disorders connected. Next. Depression in women. What does that look like? So depression is more common among women than men. There are biological, life cycle, hormone, and psychosocial factors linked to women's higher depression rate. Menopause, fall in the estrogen that I discussed, stresses of home and work, responsibilities. Next. So depression in men is the symptoms are different from women. Symptoms elicited include feeling very tired, irritable, loss of interest, and difficulty sleeping. There's substance use, alcohol and drugs. Often they are frustrated, irritable, angry. Although many women attempt suicide, many more men die by suicide in the US. Next. Depression in seniors. So, depression in seniors, they can go through complicated grief of their spouse, and there may be time to seek professional help. There's medical conditions, heart disease, stroke, cancer, vascular depression. Highest rates of suicides are in older white males, ages 85 and older. High rate of suicide in the United States, likely they have underlying depression, which may or may not have been diagnosed. Next. Depression in teens, children. Child with depression may pretend to be sick, refuse to attend school, cling to a parent. There may be trouble at school. They may be negative. A major symptom is irritability, and they often feel misunderstood. Before puberty, males and females are equal chance for depression. By age 15, girls are twice as likely as boys to have clinical depression. Adolescence comes with great change, so they're forming their identity, there's gender issues, sexuality, and making decisions. And depression can occur with also eating disorders, anxiety, substance use, and with increased risk of suicide. Next. So what are some treatments? So often, a depressed patient may go to their PCP, and sometimes, even they may start them on, or a psychiatrist or psychiatric provider. So they'll go there, and if they go with depression, they may be prescribed SSRIs. So these are your selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. I'm not going to go into too much on this, but they basically work on the serotonin. They affect the reuptake of serotonin in the brain, and so next category is SNRIs, serotonin and norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors. And Both of these categories of medications have fewer side effects than your older antidepressants. But common side effects include like headache, nausea, feelings of jitteriness, insomnia. Next. Those are the tricyclic antidepressants, are an older type of medications that was prescribed, but lately people have not been using, providers have not been prescribing so much of that because they do have concerning side effects, heart issues, dizziness, and it's dangerous if taken by overdose. Next. Yeah, I'm not going to go into too much on this. This is an older class of antidepressants. Next. What one needs to know is that antidepressants do take 4 to 6 weeks before reaching full effect and must not stop the medication unless by the direction of a provider. And sudden discontinuation, if you're prescribed an antidepressant, it causes withdrawal symptoms and obviously return of your symptoms. Usually we try another antidepressant and one does not work. Next. And you see this, you know, I'm sure people have heard about this in the news about FDA warning on antidepressants. There's a black box warning, but patients taking antidepressants should be close. Usually that's why they're closely monitored. And, you know, honestly, it's not the antidepressant per se causing the suicidal thing. It's when the depression lifts, patients usually have some sort of energy to make plans. In the NIMH study, 1998 to 2006 pediatric trials, the results showed that the benefit outweighed the risk for children and adolescents, the benefit of being on a medication. Next. Treatment for bipolar disorder. So usually if the treatment is a lifelong, treatment for bipolar disorder is a lifelong treatment. You have your mood stabilizers. I'm not going to go really too much into it. You have lithium, Depakote, or they may start you on antipsychotics, antidepressant with antipsychotic combination. And okay, next. Mood stabilizers is what usually providers start for someone who has bipolar disorder, and lithium is the gold standard for the treatment of bipolar. And in some instances, we use it to also treat like severe depression and suicidal ideation, but it requires like monitoring blood levels. Next. Psychotherapy. So other forms of treatment is CBT. What it does is to restructure negative thought patterns, assist to interpret the environment and interact in a positive. It's a therapy that, you know, often is used if you go for like psychotherapy. And if it's effective for mild to moderate depression, for teens, combination medication and psychotherapy is most effective. Next. And let's say if patients have tried many different medications, mood stabilizers, we do have something called ECT, and that's electroconvulsive therapy. And it's indicated for treatment-resistant severe depression, and the patient receives anesthesia, muscle relaxant, and so there is hope out there for patients who have tried many different medications and nothing is working. Patients are usually on an antidepressant, but you know, its side effects include confusion, memory loss, which are usually short-term. Next. So I just want to touch upon suicide because one of the issues is untreated depression and untreated mood disorders unfortunately can lead to suicide. So according to 2020 CDC data, suicide is a huge public health concern. Over 45,900 lives lost in the US, and that's 2020 data. 12th leading cause of death. It's complicated, tragic, but it can be preventable. Next. So what do the statistics show? Suicide was the second leading cause of death among individuals between ages of 10 to 14 and 25 to 34. And the third leading cause of death among individuals between the age of 15 to 24. And the fourth leading cause of death among individuals between ages 35 and 44. There were nearly 2 times as many suicides in the United States as there were homicides. And that's pretty significant. And this is all 2020 data. Next. Risk factors. So what are some risk factors for suicide? Depression, other mental disorders, substance use disorder, certain medical conditions, chronic pain, a prior suicide attempt, a family history of suicide, violence, even physical sexual abuse, having guns, other firearms in the home, having recently released from prison or jail, being exposed to other suicidal behaviors such as family members, peers, or even celebrities. Next. Suicide prevention. Many people have some or all of the risk factors but do not attempt. Suicide thoughts or actions are really a sign of extreme distress, and it's not a harmless bid for attention and really should not be ignored. And family and friends, they're the first likely ones to recognize. So the warning signs of suicide, and can be the first step towards really helping an at-risk individual. Someone who has to really consider suicide is really struggling, is really hopeless, and they cannot find any sort of hope. You may say, let's go do this, let's go do that. No, they are extremely hopeless. They just cannot find, often they're very negativistic too. And it's important to get them help. Next. Tips for kids and teens. CDC, suicide prevention and coping skills. So for teens, take care of them, take care of yourself, talk to others. Avoid, obviously like the first presentation, drugs, alcohol. Take a break and recognize when you need help, reach out. Next. This is a study, a systematic review actually, exploring mental health of children and adolescents amidst COVID-19. So what they basically, I think some of us know that what came out of this study was that anxiety, depression, disturbance in sleep and appetite, as well as impairment in social interactions were the most common presentations. And that compared to adults, the pandemic may continue to have increased long-term adverse consequences on children's and adolescents' mental health. So it is important really to monitor the children's and adolescents' mental health and continue to see how you can get them help, really, honestly. Next. So these are some action steps for helping someone in emotional pain. Obviously, if someone's actively suicide in danger, you have to get them to the emergency room or call 911 for help. Ask, are you thinking about killing yourself? Keeping them safe. Reduce access to lethal items or places. Be there. Listen carefully. What are they saying? Acknowledge their feelings. Validate. Help them connect. The new number, this is the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. It's very easy to number. And stay connected. Follow up and stay in touch after a crisis. Next. So if you are in crisis, you can call or text the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline, and they're usually available 24 hours, 7 days a week. And it's really confidential support to anyone in a suicidal crisis or emotional distress. And the support is available via live chat. Next. Suicide is the blank leading cause of death among people ages 15 to 34 in the United States. Anyone want to take a guess? Yes, second. Second leading cause of death among people ages 15 to 34 in the United States. Next. Half of all mental illness occurs before a person turns blank years old, and 3/4 of mental illness begins before age 24. 14. I just want to leave with this quote. Suicide is a whispered word, inappropriate for polite company. Family and friends often pretend they do not hear the words dread sound even when it's uttered. For suicide is a taboo subject that stigmatizes not only the victim, but the survivors as well. Okay. Next. Some references. Next. Next. Thank you for having me speak here. May is actually Mental Health Month, so I'm glad to be speaking here during this month, and I'll be happy to answer any questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kurian. Thank you so much for talking about mood disorders. We're going to be taking a 5-minute break now. You've got some index cards. If you need pens or anything like that, you can definitely raise your hand and we can get you index cards and pens to answer any questions during the question and answer. We are taking a 5-minute break. Thank you. We're going to continue this amazing seminar. Next, we're going to hear from Dr. Nisha Pradeep. She's an advanced practice nurse. She has a doctorate as a nurse practitioner. She has a private practice in the community, and her focus is mainly on the adult and geriatric populations. Dr. Pradeep will present on the topic of anxiety. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me here. I hope everyone's having a good time, and I'm talking about anxiety. I know we have a very little time left. So, anxiety, it's a normal human emotion that we all experience from time to time. It's like it help us to be productive at certain situations. Like if you're going for an exam, you feel a little bit anxiety. Going for a job interview, you feel a little bit nervousness. That helps us to prepare and be our best. But anxiety disorder is different from normal anxiety. So anxiety disorder it's a very persistent, intense anxiety and fear that affects your normal daily life, your relationships, is it working? Your ability to focus at work, focus in school. So it reduces the overall quality of your life. There is an increase in anxiety disorder since the pandemic, as per the World Health Organization. I mean, you can you can go to the second slide. The next one. Thank you. As per the World Health Organization, there's a 25% increase in prevalence of anxiety disorders since the pandemic, and there's also an increase in the rate of anxiety in children and adolescents since the pandemic. Because we all gone through this uncertain time, and it created a lot of anxiety in most of us. Next slide, please. Let's look at some of the symptoms that you may experience when you have an anxiety disorder. Excessive worry. These worries that you feel that you can't control or stop. Feeling nervous, feeling irritable for every little thing that makes you a little bit agitated. Overwhelming, feel that a lot of muscle tension. You may feel some palpitations, shortness of breath, dizziness, etc. Let's look, next slide, please. Next, there are a few common types of anxiety disorders. Generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, social anxiety disorder, specific phobia, agoraphobia, and separation anxiety disorder. Next slide. Generalized anxiety disorder is a persistent, excessive worry, intense worry that you cannot control about everyday activities that we have. Be worrying about your finance, the things that you have to do next day, about your work schedule. They always feel that there is something bad is going to happen. They're preparing for the worst all the time, anticipating the worst all the time, and it affects your quality of life, your ability to sleep, your ability to focus. The next slide. Panic disorder. The core symptom of panic disorder is a sudden, intense, and recurring panic attacks. It's a sudden wave of fear in the absence of an actual danger. During a panic attack, the person might experience chest pain, chest tightness, palpitations, shortness of breath, dizziness, chills, hot flashes, nausea, sometimes vomiting, feel like they're going to lose control or die. These symptoms are so severe that they feel that they're having a heart attack or a life-threatening illness. Next slide. Social anxiety disorder is an excessive fear of being judged or ridiculed or rejected from a social situation. For example, talking to somebody new, asking questions in front of people, or having a presentation like I had today. So that's some of the social anxiety. But in a social anxiety disorder, people often try to avoid these situations at any cost because they feel that they're being looked at. they're going to be, people are judging them, or they're going to make some mistakes and they're going to have an embarrassment moment in front of other people. So these worries are very intense, and they often find it's very difficult to control, or sometimes it affects their ability to go to work or go to school, or even have a drink or eat in front of people. Specific phobia is an intense anxiety about certain situations or objects. Like the common ones are like phobia to fear of flight, fear of heights, insects. Some people have fear of needles and blood. This is very intense. The anxiety is very intense, and they may experience a panic attack in the presence of such objects, or being in that moment, or even a mere thought of it can cause a panic attack. Agoraphobia is a fear of being in a place where the escape might be difficult. So some of the common ones are using public transportation, being in enclosed spaces, being in a crowded area, or being outside of the home. Sometimes when it's very severe, there are often people don't even leave home. Separation anxiety disorder is most common in children, but adults also have it. It's an intense fear of being separated from the person they are attached to, or a place they are attached to. Often, when you can see in children, they show a lot of tantrums, or they start crying, or they come up with a lot of physical illness to avoid going to school or go away from their parents. Some of the causes for anxiety disorder: family history. If you have a close family relative who has anxiety disorder, there are high chance for you to develop an anxiety disorder. Children who are exposed to traumatic events or abuse can develop anxiety disorder at any point in their lifetime. Adults who had experienced trauma also can develop anxiety disorder. Chronic stress, building of chronic stress, like balancing work-life balance, taking care of your finance, chronic illness, managing a chronic illness, like having the influx of negative news that we receive every day. Being in this country, we wake up every day with the news of mass shooting somewhere, or we hear about the war, we hear about economic crisis, we hear about these Republicans and Democrats fighting endless. So all these are negative news that we're receiving, and this is chronically building our stress, which also can trigger anxiety disorder. Substance use, as Dr. Chaka mentioned before, a lot of substance uses, like alcohol intakes, other substances can also induce trigger anxiety disorders. Excessive intake of caffeine also can cause anxiety. Next slide, please. Types of treatment could be a combination of psychotherapy, medications, and lifestyle modification. Psychotherapy, effective ways of psychotherapy modes are cognitive behavioral therapy and exposure therapy. Medications that we use, SSRIs, SNRIs, which is also known as antidepressants, beta blockers, which are blood pressure medications which are used to reduce the physiological symptoms associated with anxiety. Benzodiazepines, which is, commonly, their common names are Xanax, Klonopin. They are also good for anxiety medications. Lifestyle modifications that we can take care of, making sure you're having a good sleep, improving your sleep hygiene, going to bed at the same time every day, looking at your sleep habits before you sleep. Are you taking, if you're not getting adequate sleep, why am I not getting adequate sleep? Am I taking a lot of caffeine? Am I exercising towards in the evening? Am I going through my phone? So these are some of the important notes. Make sure that you go to bed at the same time every day. Keep your phones and all the screens away from you an hour before, and start winding down activities. You can read a book, you can take a bath, or have a guided meditation. There are apps called Calm or Headspace that you can use at night that has guided meditation which promotes sleep. There are some And then avoid substance use, limiting substance uses, daily exercise, at least 30 minutes of aerobic exercise seems to develop mental health, improve mental health. Healthy diet, stress reduction techniques like mindfulness, meditation, etc. Helps. What are some of the screening questions that you can ask yourself to see if you are somebody who suffers from anxiety disorder? Am I suffering, am I having a repetitive, negative thoughts? Am I having trouble stopping these thoughts or controlling these worries? Do I spend most of my days worrying about these or engaging in these kind of thoughts? Am I experiencing palpitations or chest tightness or shaking or sweating? Am I having trouble sleeping? Do I avoid activities or meeting people because I feel that I'm going to have anxiety? What are the measures that you can do to help yourself? First of all, talk to somebody. Talk to a loved one or talk to a friend who you trust to. Make some lifestyle modifications, like take a look at your lifestyle habits. What are you doing? How many hours of sleep are you getting? What's your exercise? Are you getting enough exercise? Are you eating right? Am I eating a lot of processed food and all the a lot of high sugary stuff? So make some changes with the diet as well. You can join a support group. There are a lot of support groups available online since the pandemic, and learning to cope, learning some of the coping skills. I'll just go over some of the coping skills. One of the effective and simple one is deep breathing exercise. So to do that, it's very simple. Make yourself in a comfortable position. You can either sit or stand or lay down. And take a deep breath for a count of 4. Hold it for a count of 7, and exhale through your mouth for a count of 8. So it's very simple: 4, 7, 8. You also making sure this while you're taking breath, you can keep your hand right below your rib cage to make sure when you take your breath, your abdomen is rising. So you want to have an abdominal breathing, like babies. They breathe through abdomen. They have this abdominal breathing. So you want that kind of breathing. So take a breath. You want to do it now? Okay, go ahead. All right. So make yourself comfortable. Close your eyes. Take a deep breath slowly through your nose. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Exhale slowly through your mouth. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. This is one of the simple exercises that you can do. Just do it for 3 to 5 minutes. You don't have to wait for an anxiety attack to happen. You can do it every day, 10 times in the morning, 10 times in the evening. It helps to reduce your stress. You can also you do it while you're having an anxiety attack, but remember that we're not trying to stop the anxiety attack with this. We're trying to reduce the volume. You probably, you are not going to be able to stop a panic attack with this. Another one that you can do is progressive muscle relaxation. It is focusing on each part of your muscle group from head to toe, tense the part and then relax. You can find those in YouTube. There are a lot of YouTube videos available on progressive muscle relaxation. Another one is taking yourself out of the place and go for a mindful walk. Mindfulness helps to stay in the present. What do you mean by mindful walk? When you go out, look around you, look at the leaves, look at the trees, what colors are they, what shapes are they, touch them, feel them. So that way you can keep your mind in the present moment. That's called mindfulness walk. That helps to reduce your stress, reduce your anxiety. Another grounding technique that's very effective is 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. If you are feeling an anxiety, I want you to look around and look at 5 things that you can see. When you look at each of the item, take a look at what their shapes are, what are they meant for, how big they are, what color are they, and then look for, touch 4 items, touch them and look at their texture, how they feel to you. You can even hold it in your hand, see how heavy they are, what shapes they are. Then listen for 3 sounds. So the listening 3 sounds, you look at where they're coming from, how far are they coming from. Then you can smell 2 things. You can smell coffee, you can either smell perfume, you can smell soap, and use one and taste one thing. So you're using all your 5 senses to keep yourself grounded. It helps to reduce your anxiety symptoms when you feel. And then meditation. Meditation is another. You can use simple meditations, breathing, taking a few breaths, and then sit down and just try to focus on one thing. That's a simple way. But you may feel that all thoughts are coming to you, but that's normal. But as soon as you become aware that you're thinking about something else, try to bring back your attention. And facing the fear of sensation. When you get an anxiety attack, mostly you feel more fearful when you have the increased heart rate, when you have the shortness of breath. It's not easy to stop it, but what you can do is get familiar with that feeling. Like exercise. When you do exercise, you would feel the same, increased heart rate and shortness of breath. So you can start doing exercise, increase the intensity to feel it more and more, so you can feel comfortable with that feeling. Another one, most of the people with panic disorder avoid going to places because of the fear of having another panic attack or not being able to get the help. So what you can do to avoid, to face that fear is to go into those places. How to do it? Step by step. So you write down, make a list of places that you're afraid of going to. Start from the least afraid place to the most. Then you start going to the least afraid place. Go to the same place over and over and over until you get very comfortable or you're able to control the anxiety while you're there. So that's the way to desensitize yourself to this fear. Now, also I told you about so we also discussed about seeking a mentor. I think I spoke to you, I'm not sure because I'm trying to fast forward it. Seek a professional help. Also, you need to know what to expect when you see a mental health professional. You're already having a lot of anxiety. There are more chances that you get more nervous when you're going to a mental health professional for the first time. So you don't want to forget anything when you're there. So take a note, write down everything that you're feeling and experiencing, and take this note with you when you go there. And just tell them what exactly you're feeling. If you're afraid to go alone, take a family member or a friend with you, and ask all the questions while you're there. And how do you help for someone else? So when you feel that somebody else is suffering from anxiety, just be supportive and listen to them without being judgmental, and then offer them help. Try to help them find a provider. Ask them, explain some of the lifestyle changes that they can make to help themselves, and stay connected with them. Okay. And I wanted to do a quick meditation. Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay, all right. You can make yourself comfortable. Keep your hands on your lap. Just relax your body. Close your eyes. Take deep breath through your nose. Exhale it through your mouth. Again, take another deep breath. Exhale through your mouth. As you exhale, you feel each muscles of your body is getting relaxed, and feel that you're becoming more and more weightless and relaxed with each exhalation. Continue to breathe normally through your nose. Feel your breath going in and out through your nostrils. And feel the rise and fall of your chest and abdomen. Continue to breathe. Now imagine yourself in a place that you're happy. Just feel the surrounding, feel the things around you. Feel how happy and calm you're feeling in that place. Feel the warmth in the room or wherever that place is. Take a deep breath through your nose. Exhale through your mouth. Take another deep breath through your nose. Exhale through your mouth. Bring your attention back to your room and slowly open your eyes. I say thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pradeep. That was amazing. Our next presenter will be Mrs. Susan Thomas. She is a licensed clinical social worker. She sees clients in her private practice. She's the founder and program director of HOPE, which stands for Healing, Opportunity, Perseverance, and Enlightenment at Northwell Health. HOPE provides a place where children and families can come together in their journey of grief. Mrs. Thomas will present on the topic of grief and loss.
I know you're all tired. It's been a long evening, so thank you for staying and for all your attention. Sorry. Okay, so we all know what it is when we say that we've experienced loss. We've all experienced loss. We've experienced losses to death, but we've also experienced other losses in our life. We may have lost a job, we may have lost a friend, we may have lost a pet. There's all kinds of losses, but today I'm going to focus on grief and loss in terms of experiencing the death of someone. Next slide, please. So let's spend a few minutes talking about this concept called grief. How do we define grief? Well, grief is the natural response to loss. It's the emotional suffering we feel when something or someone that we love is taken away. Grief, next slide, please. Grief is the process, the slide before, yeah. Next one, yeah, there we go. Grief is the process of learning to live without, learning to live with emptiness, trying to make meaning out of deprivation. Grief becomes a way of keeping connected to the person that we have lost. And even though grief is a natural emotion, often the pain of loss can feel very, very overwhelming. All of you know, if you've experienced a loss, how overwhelming that those emotions can be. And because it's intense and it's uncomfortable to feel, we really try to often find ways to avoid experiencing the intensity of the emotion. And we do it through distraction or busyness. But grief, it lasts a long time. Recent research has shown that very intense grieving can last from 3 months to a year, but many people continue experiencing profound grief for 2 years or more. And often our society expects us to be doing fine in 2 weeks, right? We get maybe 3 days for bereavement leave, and then in 2 weeks, we're supposed to be back to normal. We're supposed to be okay. And it's common to think that there's something wrong with us if our grief lasts too long. But it's really important to remember that we need to allow ourselves to grieve and move through that grief process in our own time and in our own way. And as the days and weeks go on and that shock after the death begins to wear off, and slowly that reality begins to set in, well, so does the pain. And so we feel that sadness and that loss, and a lot of things can trigger that sadness. It could be something that someone says or something, a memory. It could be a song. Some people think that being strong means you don't show emotion. People think that you can be logical about grief, but that's not true. Thoughts make logical sense, but our feelings, they come from the heart. And our feelings are often not rational. Being strong is not being stoic. Being strong is really about being comfortable about how we think and how we feel and not hiding our feelings. And really allowing ourselves to experience our feelings fully. That's the true sign of strength. Next slide, please. Over the last few years, this COVID-19 pandemic that we've experienced has changed our world dramatically, and it's impacted our grief in really profound ways. Our community, our Malayali community, is a very tight-knit one, and we're connected with one another. And under normal circumstances, when we lose a loved one, we turn to others for love and support. We might gather together with family and friends, we might have prayer meetings, we have a wake, a funeral where we share our sorrow and our happy memories. We offer support and care to one another. But what happened during the pandemic? It wreaked havoc on many of these rituals because we couldn't fully engage in the traditions that are so important to the grieving process. And it made our grief and loss much more difficult to manage. And because of the restrictions due to COVID-19, we may experience feelings of regret because we weren't there with our loved ones in their final moments, and we couldn't say goodbye in the way that we needed to. You know, grief can be an isolating experience, even under normal circumstances, but social distancing and the quarantine that we went through made that process lonelier still. Loss is such a reminder of how many things are out of our control. And sudden and unexpected loss can bring on feelings of anxiety and fear along with that grief. And so how do we cope with grief? Next slide, please. Remember that grief is a process that takes a long time to move through. And I think of it as a journey towards healing. And I know that some of you may have heard about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who talks about stages of grief. And she talks about 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. But stages suggest that we go through one stage and then the next stage, sort of like a linear process. But grief, it doesn't work that way. And so thanatologists like William Worden, Teresa Rando, Alan Wolfelt, they all talk about tasks of grief as opposed to stages of grief. Next slide, please. Each person's journey through grief is different, and for all who are mourning, we go through 3 basic tasks of grief as we begin to process that loss. The first is a thinking task, the second is an emotional task, and the third is a growing and doing tasks. And so these tasks are not linear, and we do a little bit of each of these tasks all at the same time. Next slide, please. So the first task of grief is that all children and bereaved adults go through is to struggle to understand the reality of the loss. Because if we think about it, whether the death was expected or unexpected, that bereaved child or adult struggles to integrate and understand the loss. You know, we all know there's a difference between intellectual knowing and emotional knowing. And so in this first task, that bereaved person struggles to realize that their loved one has died and is not going to return. And this task of acknowledging and understanding that the loved one has died is very often the most difficult and painful aspect of the grief process, because the whole process of grief is moving from a physical relationship we have with our loved one to an internal relationship with the memories. Grief is that stuff that happens in between. We all have physical relationships with our loved ones, seeing them, talking with them, hugging them, being physically connected to them. But after a death, we lose that physical connection, and all we're left with are memories. And at the beginning, these memories can be very, very painful because we're longing to talk and be with that loved one again. And so for many people who are bereaved, they remain connected to their grief until they can connect with their memories. There's a wonderful line in a book, Tuesdays with Maury, and the line is, "Death is the end of a life, not the end of a relationship. Death is the end of a life, not the end of a relationship." And I'll give you an example of what this looks like. I remember there was a 12-year-old whose mom had died suddenly in the middle of the night, and she had a brain aneurysm, and he had two younger siblings. And so he had come to the Center for Hope. It's a counseling program that we offer. And so one day, it was about a year and a half after his mom died, and he said to me, you know, Susan, I'm really sad that my mom died, but I'll be okay because, you know, he was an athlete, and his two siblings are also athletes, and so he played a lot of different sports. And so he said to me, you know, when Mom was alive, she couldn't come to all of my games. She had to go to my sister's games, she had to go to my brother's games, but now every single game that I'm at, I feel her there with me. I feel her cheering me on. And that's moving from that physical relationship to that internal relationship with the memories. Next slide, please. The second task of grief is to process the pain of grief. Working through that pain of grief has to be dealt with on a number of different levels, because if we think about it, grief affects us on so many different levels. Grief is physical. We feel it in our body. We feel tired. We feel weighed down. We feel sick to our stomach. It's a physical experience. Grief is cognitive. It's hard to focus. It's hard to concentrate. What used to take 5 minutes takes 25 minutes. You're opening the refrigerator. You forget what you opened the refrigerator for. I do that anyway. But a lot of people, when they're grieving, they go through that difficult experience. Grief is spiritual. A lot of people start to question and wonder, or struggle with their feelings about and their faith in God. And so when the loss first happens, it's almost like we go into autopilot. We go into this shock, numb-like state, and it's almost like a shudder comes down on our brain. And as the weeks and months go on, that shudder starts to come up, and the intensity of the grief comes at us in a way we didn't expect. Our mind is very self-protective. It only allows us to feel what we can at a given time. But as time goes on, that shudder starts to come up, and we begin to feel the full intensity of the grief. Next slide, please. And so as the weeks go on and that shock begins to wear off, we begin to feel the feelings of sadness, of guilt, of anger, fear, sorrow, and all these feelings and thoughts bombard the soul, and they struggle to be experienced, and they come together in this big jumbled mass of emotions that sits right here. And so what we have to help individuals to do is to look at the different emotions, dissect them, take them apart, try to gain some level of mastery over them. I've worked with many grieving families for over 30, 35 years, and one of the things that they've taught me is that the path to healing is through the sorrow. It's through the sorrow. And so that grieving child or adult's going to go through all of these emotions, and they begin that slow and that painful process of readjustment, readjusting to a life without their loved ones. And so we come to our third task of grief. And the third task of grief is to continue to live fully in the present and open up to the future, reinvesting their emotional energy. And so in this task, that child or adult who's grieving has to proactively choose to go on in the midst of their feelings of pain or despair. And this choice is really important because rather than seeing themselves as overcome by grief, they can begin to look at grief as an active process. We don't have control over what happened, but we do have control over how we respond to what happened. And rather than looking at grief as something that overwhelms us, we can begin to look at grief as something that transforms us. We can begin to do things in honor of our loved one that changes our life and the lives of other people. There's a little girl whose mom died of cancer. She's going to be an oncologist. A little girl whose brother died on a cruise ship. Her mission is to make sure that every cruise ship in America has a competent doctor. The woman who started MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, she lost her 17-year-old to a drunk driver. So these individuals have made a decision that they're going to change their life and the lives of other people in honor of their loved one. And that's really what the work of grief is. It's trying to make meaning out of the loss. Next slide, please. There's a saying that time heals all wounds. The reality is it's not time, it's what we do with the time that determines the healing process. So repeating the story, telling others what happened, helps that bereaved child and adult alike. It's as if that story is being framed in their mind. The loss is so unimaginable that the bereaved need time to get their mind around what happened. Putting grief into words reduces its power. A grieving child or adult is going to go to that place of pain, but they're going to go step by step. They're going to go inch by inch. We need to stay with them. We need to hold their pain. We need to validate their experience. Our goal isn't to help them feel better. Our goal is to help them get better at feeling the intensity of the experience. You know, emotions are messages from our soul that need to be embraced rather than enemies to escape from. So we need to give sorrow words. Sorrow needs expression through art, through music, through play, and even through silence. We need to listen with our eyes, with our heart, with our souls. Next slide, please. And so what do we do? Well, one of the things that's really important in grieving is to be able to create rituals. Creating rituals around remembering and honoring a loved one is really important, and it's a very significant form of expression. We can also share memories of the person who died. You know, and sometimes we're afraid to talk about the person who died, thinking that it's going to cause pain. But research actually shows that the sharing of memories, the sharing of stories, actually aids in the process of healing grief. So grief is a process that happens over time, and healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means remembering that person with love and letting loving memories stir good feelings that support us as we go on to enjoy life. We can also help grieving individuals find new ways to stay connected to the person who died and help them move from that physical relationship to that internal relationship with the memories. So one idea is to, on a special day, it could be a birthday, it could be an anniversary, you could have you can write a letter. You can have the whole family write letters or draw pictures. You can go to a pretty beach, a park, take those letters, tie them to balloons, biodegradable balloons, but you can tie them and you can release the balloons. It's a beautiful ritual that kids, I remember working with a 12-year-old a girl whose mom had died, and she said, I was doing this ritual with her, and she was saying, wow, I know my mom's going to be able to read that letter. So it's really powerful. You can make memory pillows with the T-shirts of the person who died. You can get a journal, and you can write letters to that person who died. Just things that you want to say to them, things you want to communicate. You can get a scrapbook and put it somewhere in the house, and anytime anybody has a memory of that person, hey, remember when so-and-so used to like to eat? Oh, let's go write that down in the book. Remember when so-and-so used to say, oh, let's go write that down in the book. Reach out to family, friends, different people, collect different stories, different memories of the person, and connect them. So as I end, I'm just going to talk about a couple of other things that we can do to help those who are grieving. You know, Mother Teresa said, we don't have to do great things, only small things with great love. So true healing takes place in relationships. Healing takes place in conversations between people. Grief that is spoken can be transformed by another's love and another's acceptance. There's a Native American proverb that says, if you give something a name and a shape, you have power over it. If you can't give it a name or a shape, it has power over you. And so it's really important to be able to give a name and a shape to that experience in grief. And so what else can we do to help those who are grieving? And I just want you to remember 4 things, 4 words: hang around, hug, hush, and hope. Hang around. We have to be there for those who are hurting, because the best gift that we can give to anyone is the gift of our presence. Our presence and our support are powerful agents of comfort and care. Maya Angelou was an amazing poet and just an amazing writer, and she said, people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, people will never forget how you made them feel. Hug. We need to embrace them in the warmth of our love and concern, and let them know that we care about them. We just need to be present. We don't have to always have the right words to say. Our loving presence is what's important. Hush. We need to listen. We don't need to talk as much as we need to listen. You know, there's an old proverb that goes, fools speak because they have to say something. Wise men speak because they have something to say. Our presence is so much more important than our words. And then finally, hope. We have to be able to offer hope to those who are hurting. Darcy Sims was a a psychologist who lost a daughter to leukemia. And after that, she spent the rest of her life as she reached out to provide hope and healing to grieving parents. And she said, hope is not the absence of pain or fear or sadness. Hope is the possibility of renewed joy. Hope is the memory of love given and love received. Each and every one of us are blessed because we are believers who have a hope that is beyond any other. And that's a hope that's founded in our faith in Jesus Christ, our Savior. And God promises us that He will never abandon us, especially during our times of grief. He's always going to provide us with love and with hope. So thank you so much. And I'm sorry I spoke so fast. We were trying to finish fast for you.
Thank you so much. You did a great job. Thank you. Our final presenter will be Dr. Jacob Palatinko, who is an advanced practice nurse and is a faculty member at Northwell Zucker Hillside. He primarily works with the child and adolescent population and is a clinical psychologist with a focus of interest in the diagnosis of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and bipolar disorder. He has actually completed his dissertation in creating a rating scale differentiating ADHD from bipolar disorder. In addition, he has a private practice in the community. Dr. Palatinko will present on the topic of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and its treatment.
Due to time constraints, I'm going to try to go fast as possible. I know we're trying to wrap it up around 8:30. I was going to say a little vignette about a patient that I've seen about 3 years ago. Parents brought him to my office with severe impulse control. He was a 13-year-old Malayali boy with autism, very high-functioning autism, does very well academically, socially somewhat awkward. After neuropsychological evaluation and testing, I told the parents that he has ADHD, and the first line of treatment is medication. So I'm going to leave that story right there, and let's go on to my slides, and I'll come back to that vignette in a few minutes. So what is ADHD? ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, is a neurodevelopmental disorder. What does that mean? Neurodevelopmental disorder meaning that it affects how the brain communicates, the structure of the brain, and the biology. Some of the other neurodevelopmental disorders that we may have heard of is bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, autism, and cerebral palsy. Now, when you talk about ADHD, also should notice that ADHD is highly comorbid. That means that it occurs primarily with other mental health disorders. Next slide, please. Causes of ADHD, we already went over that. We spoke about the genetic predisposition. There is up to 77 to 80% heritability factor, meaning that if you're a parent with ADHD, your children have high rates of genetic predisposition. Recent research has shown that there is up to 85% as heritability factor. It was once thought that ADHD only affected the prefrontal cortex of the brain, which is right here. But now, with advance in science and functional MRI and EEG, we know that ADHD affects other parts of the brain. I could barely see my own slides. All righty. So prenatal substance abuse. One of the risk factors for children developing ADHD is that maternal smoking, maternal use of illicit drugs. So it's very advisable to tell parents, obviously, to avoid smoking and drinking alcohol. Next slide, please. There are 3 subtypes of ADHD. There is the inattentive type, there's the hyperactive impulsive type, and also the combined type. So what are the differences? Just as the name implies, the inattentive type, the child has severe issue with attention span. The hyperactive impulsive type is the child who's restless and who's impulsive. Now, what is impulsive? Impulsive meaning a child can't control, self-control. And the combined type is when the child has all 3 symptoms, the impulsivity, the inattention, and the hyperactivity. Now, ADHD was once considered a disorder of moral value, later called minimal brain damage, and after that as hyperkinetic disorder. And it's not only a disorder of childhood. Obviously, ADHD also occurs as adult as well. I have a 65-year-old woman who has ADHD. So many people think that ADHD only occurs as in childhood. Next slide, please. So there's restlessness as symptoms, there's the inattentiveness, there's impulsiveness. It always surprises a lot of people when I said ADHD children can be aggressive. Yes, once again, it's related to poor frustration tolerance and aggression. So in the mental health field, there is this dilemma, prematurely diagnosing children with bipolar disorder the moment you hear aggression. So it's important to go through neuropsychological testing and other rating scales that are available before jumping into diagnosis. Next slide, please. So how is ADHD diagnosed? ADHD may be diagnosed using the following. Obviously, a mental status examination. You see children coming into the office who's not able to stay still. They might be underneath my desk. They might be on my desk. There is a rating scale called the teacher version Vanderbilt and a parent version Vanderbilt. These are data collected by the parents and from the teachers, seeing how that child is able to stay still in class. Is he or she able to focus? So these are data that we gather before making a diagnosis. Neuropsychological evaluation. Now this testing is done by a neuropsychologist. The testing is done over 2 to 3 days. It gathers so much information such as memory index, processing speed, visual spatial data. There's a lot of information. With that information, you could come to a clear understanding of what the child's diagnosis is. And CPT is a component of the neuropsychological evaluation, which stands for Continuous Performance Task. Now, how is ADHD treated? Research has shown over and over again the first line of treatment for ADHD is stimulants. You've probably heard of medications such as Adderall, Concerta, Focalin, methylphenidate, etc. These are the first line of treatment for ADHD. Now, there's individuals who cannot tolerate stimulants because of other underlying issues, such as an individual's seizure, head injury, cardiac anomaly, individuals with bipolar disorder. These individuals cannot tolerate stimulants, so we go for another medication, which is called non-stimulants. Some of the common non-stimulants out there in the markets are such as Wellbutrin, Strattera. There's a latest SNRI, which is known as Qelbree, which is after 20 years of being in the, 20 years later on, this is the most latest non-stimulant medication, which is FDA approved for both children and adults. There's a third category called alpha agonist. Now, alpha agonist is a subtype of medication for children with ADHD who are restless, impulsive, who also struggles with insomnia. Medications such as Intuniv, Clonidine, those are considered alpha agonist. Now, some of the behavioral therapy that are used to help with children with ADHD, there's the executive functioning training, helping the child to, or adult to plan, adapt, thinking, improving, etc. Next slide, please. Damn, that's small. Okay, so once again, Dr. Chacko had spoken about the reward center in our brain, the dopamine, norepinephrine. Those are the two chemicals that are primarily responsible for ADHD symptoms. There's a misconception in the society we live in that the stimulants that we give to the children stimulates, which is really misconception. The stimulants does not stimulate a child. What it does is it reduces the reuptake of dopamine and norepinephrine, so it's readily available at the synapses. So it does not stimulate a child to make the child more restless. It makes them less and calmer. Next slide, please. Now, the implication of not treating ADHD. I don't know if you remember, I started talking about a child, a Malayali child who came to my office. Now, this was 3 years ago. He was 12 years old at that time. The mom called recently, 3 years later. Now he's 15. Mom said that he started using marijuana because he couldn't regulate himself. He stopped. He actually jumped off the bus a few times, poor impulse control. His memory is so poor that he misses bus stops. So he needs to find a happiness or happy spot, so he started using marijuana. Now the parents realized 3 years ago when I gave them the diagnosis of ADHD and medication is an option, they were not ready. But now they realize medication is necessary. So rather than the child self-medicating, I prescribed him a small dose of stimulant. He's doing much better. He's never had academic issues, but it was the forgetfulness, the poor impulse control, etc. Delaying treatment for ADHD leads to continued psychosocial disability and struggle in relationship, even being addicted to illicit drugs. As I mentioned earlier, children or adults who cannot regulate themselves will find other ways of regulating themselves. That might be alcohol, that might be other illicit drugs. Next slide, please. Misdiagnosis. Children may prematurely be diagnosed as having bipolar disorder. Why? Because both of these disorders are affecting the main parts of the brain, which are both targeting the prefrontal cortex. Now, the bipolar disorder and ADHD, as Anita mentioned, one of the dissertation I did was creating a rating scale to differentiate these two diagnoses because they're highly comorbid. That means bipolar patients can have ADHD symptoms. It's not unusual for both patients to have these both disorders and be on medications for both of this at the same time. ADHD can. One of the other factors is that ADHD is highly comorbid with learning disorders. Children with dyslexia, dyscalculia, and other learning disorders may also have ADHD. So when you treat the ADHD, the learning disorder also gets better. Next slide, please. Disparity in treatment. It's not surprising that most of the times parents bring their children with ADHD are boys. Why? Because most of the girls are not hyperactive, are not impulsive, so the boys get the higher rate of treatment. Now the girls suffer long term because they become anxious, they internalize. According to Neuro, which is a Singapore-based computer program for children with ADHD, 83% of Indian parents discontinue treatment of stimulants after 1 month, which is not surprising. 90% of Indian parents who come to my office tell me after a few days of child being on the medication, I stopped it. We've been praying about it. We've been taking it to the achan or the pastor, which are all great things, not minimizing it, but there is a place for medication and therapy. According to the CDC, there were 6 million children diagnosed with ADHD in the year of 2019, between the ages of 13 and 17. Now, what ADHD is not? ADHD is not a moral flaw. ADHD is not because the child or adult's character. Having ADHD or any other mental health disorder should not hinder you from seeking treatment due to the feeling of embarrassment. ADHD does not mean that you're stupid or you have low IQ. Next slide, please. Thank you for your time. Please do not hesitate to reach out for help regardless of your struggles. There is no shame in asking for help. It may be the strongest thing one can do. By the way, these slides were made by my daughter, Emily. She asked me for a raise this month just to make the slide. Thank you so much.
I'm just going to ask some of them. This is one per speaker.
Just take these two.
Okay. Thank you all for that beautiful presentations. I feel like, yes, they deserve a round of applause. I feel like we could have heard from each of you an entire day. And you guys are so knowledgeable, so thank you for coming, preparing, and presenting. We've all took notes and learned a great deal. So we have a ton of questions, but I don't think we have time to ask all of them. So I'm going to, I have some questions for each speaker. So I'll try to focus just on your topics. So Dr. Chacko, you talked about alcohol half-life being 5 to 7 days. So if somebody is watching and they only drink on the weekends, should we be concerned that they're addicted at this point?
So